Hi everyone, my name is Serhii Plokhy. I'm in the history department, which is that way, and also the Ukrainian Research Institute, which is that way. So I walk here quite often back and forth. The book that I'm going to talk about, the title is Chernobyl Roulette, War in the Nuclear Disaster Zone. And it is a book on the current Russo-Ukrainian war, on the aspect that, in my opinion, doesn't get as much attention as it should. The nuclear weapons in general and nuclear is an important part of thinking about this war. Under the administration of President Biden, the main concern in terms of supplying Ukraine with weapons on time and the sort of weapons that Ukraine needed was Russian use of nuclear weapons. And there is a lot of written about that, a lot of concern about that. What gets really missed in that story is that the war in Ukraine went nuclear already on the very first day of the all-out Russian invasion, which was the 24th of February, 2022. On that day, the Russian army, or more specifically units of army, but also the internal forces, took over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the decommissioned nuclear power plant. Within roughly 1 week, on March the 6th, the Russian army attacked Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It is still under the Russian control today. 6 reactors that are there and were at that time working. So my book focuses on the occupation of Chernobyl, with one chapter dealing also with the developments at Zaporizhzhia. This is between late February and late March of 2022, when a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive pushed Russian forces from Kyiv to the Belarusian border, and Ukraine reclaimed Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So what also happened was that the Ukrainian prosecutors, General Prosecutor's Office, the officials went there collecting information on war crimes, but there were also journalists, including the journalists working for Reckoning Project, supported at that time by USAID, who were there as well, extensively interviewing people who were under occupation. I was lucky enough to get access to the journalistic side. I was meeting also with the people in General Prosecutor's Office, but it was very useful, but I didn't get any materials from them, but I got materials on the journalistic side. And then my biggest challenge was to find sources on the Russian side, which were mostly, the Russians celebrated their takeover of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There were TV crews that were going there. The 2 commanding officers that commanded the operation received the Golden Stars of the Hero of Russia. So they were on TV, interviewed, and so on and so forth, for allegedly saving the world from another Chernobyl. Those were my sources, and I looked at that story, first of all, trying to reconstruct what happened there. This is a history of present, a history of today. So you have to put in chronological order things that happened, and not the other way around. Another thing, I looked at that as a historian of Ukraine, late Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine, and then I looked at that as a historian of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. So in terms of the story itself, there was a very interesting dynamic, in a sense that the Ukrainian crew that worked there, altogether around 300 people, including the National Guard that was protecting the station. The engineers in particular, they were able to turn the tables on the occupiers. They were actually kidnapped, but they turned the kidnappers into kidnapped by using the knowledge about the nuclear power plant that was decommissioned. Neither Russians, nobody else has actually knowledge about that, because Chernobyl is so unique. So they forced them to follow particular rulers. They couldn't enter certain areas without the permit issued by the Ukrainian foremen and people in charge. So that was interesting in its own right. Then before that, a few years ago, I wrote a book on Chernobyl 1986. And it was striking to see to what degree what we know about the Soviet Union in '86 is very much presented in Russia of 2022, 2023. So it's top-down, it's complete disregard for human life and also health of your own people. The Chernobyl was, in '86, tens of thousands of young military recruits were sent into the most dangerous places, used as biorobots. Nothing changed there in terms of the Russian army. So they were digging trenches near the Red Forest, the most contaminated area in the zone, and so on and so forth. It was interesting to see what happened on the Ukrainian side, because Ukrainians ended up to be in complete isolation. The front line moved behind them. And they had to self-organize, which was quite different. So it wasn't a top-down system. They had to answer to a number of questions, and one of them, okay, whether they should stay, whether they should leave, whether they should fight or not. And both in Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainian personnel comes from the company towns, which were the towns that were built in the late Soviet Union, were multi-ethnic in their composition. A lot of people came from Russia, including graduating from the institutions of higher learning there. And it was interesting to see how they were answering those questions and decided that in this fight between much stronger Russia and much weaker Ukraine, they're mostly Russian-speaking communities. They decided, they created in their own cities the self-defense units. They were fighting in Zaporizhzhia, and so on and so forth. So that was interesting in a sense how the Soviet society really went into different directions when you look at what happened at Chernobyl. Now, the big and most frightening discovery for me was that the international community in general was not prepared for the takeover of nuclear power plants. There are no protocols. There is no legal base on which the International Atomic Energy Agency is supposed to act. It is not clear what is loyalty and what is betrayal for the soldiers and personnel of the nuclear power plants, whether you defend your nuclear power plant like it was in Zaporizhzhia and there is a fight, or the loyalty is really to the world as a whole and you surrender because otherwise there can be a nuclear accident. And my overall conclusion was that we have, as a humanity, have no business of building new nuclear power plant, and we are allegedly on the verge of the nuclear renaissance, until we learn how to protect the ones that exist there. There are 440 reactors. There are no protocols. There is no legal base. There is no institutional capacity to deal with the repetition of what happened in Chernobyl, in Zaporizhzhia. And then last year, Ukrainian troops were approaching the Russian nuclear power plant around Kursk. So it's not an argument in this book or in general what I write, pro or against nuclear, but it's argument in favor of the nuclear safety. And we have a really, really serious crisis in Ukraine, and no one said that this is the last war. So thank you for your attention.